A life is not measured in days, but in the journey we dare to take, and the depth with which we live each moment.
My name's Rob. I guess it all started when my dad first started taking me fishing, pretty much from the moment I could walk, I could imagine. He was an avid angler. Well, I fished for many years, and then I got really into like a music scene, and with that, you know, I met a few lads that used to ride bikes, and I got really into them as well, and being quite compulsive, I decided one day to go and get one, and before I knew it, 5 years had passed. I was out riding my bike in the winter one day, and something just come over me, and I ended up taking a little bit of a detour to a tackle shop, and that was it. I guess the spark was lit again straight away from there, and I haven't stopped since. When I got back into it, I ended up pretty much going to a few old haunts, some that I'd fished back in my early teens. One of them was a park lake that I'll probably go into a little bit more later on, and another one was a really small pit in the Lea Valley that I had quite a bit of success on when I was a little bit younger. When I first got back to the lakes, like, you know, I was so out of touch, but on my first session I'd managed to get a bite and unfortunately lost it, but I knew I could then get a bite, and then what followed on from there, you know, just really ignited me even further, because I'd landed one on my second session from, you know, typically quite a hard pit from what I can imagine these days. Yeah, like it was the depths of winter, December, late December, just after Christmas if I remember rightly. And yeah, not exactly the ideal time to go out carp fishing, but that was it, the buzz was back and I just wanted to be out on the bank as much as I could. You know, the lakes now, to be honest, like everything progresses, you know, the fish are better, the lakes are bigger, the lakes are harder, they present themselves with so many different challenges. Every session was a learning curve, and, you know, truth be told, it's always still is. I guess if you ain't learning something, then you're not moving forward. But yeah, just threw myself in at the deep end and, you know, kept on treading water and kept on catching, I suppose. Yeah, there's always been like a lot that's gone into my fishing. You know, I'm an outdoorsy person. I've been a landscaper for 17 years. You know, I wanted to be outside, just the thrill of being outdoors, being amongst nature, the sanctuary and the tranquility of it all, just always, you know, really sort of got me going. And, you know, that's it. It's just literally just being out there. I've always liked my own sort of space, bit of peace and quiet, and then, you know, being on the banks gave me that and more. You know, time to think, time to sort of decompress, process life a little bit more, and, you know, the more I go, the more free I feel, and, you know, that's the ultimate goal, I think. I want to catch big fish, but I want to be as wild as possible. I want to be a human being. You know, just living life how we're supposed to, doing something that you love. You know, I suppose we all want a place where we feel like ourselves, and you know, I've never really, you know, bought into the system, I suppose, without going too far into it, but just want to feel alive. I want to be happy being me, and that's it, you know. Like, I guess in a nutshell, being out there is the closest thing that I've ever felt to freedom. Being outside, being amongst nature, being amongst the wildlife, seeing the seasons change, being in tune with it all. It just makes me feel alive.
So after an incredible winter fishing that little pit in the Lea Valley, I turned my attentions towards a park lake that I'd fished in my teens. I first wet a line there in 2009, and the year before that there was a fish kill on there, so the amount of fish in there had obviously reduced quite a lot, and there was only a small family of carp left. You know, at the time there wasn't any sort of club or syndicate or anything like that on there. It was pretty much just a free-for-all, and the few of us that were fishing down there at the time, you know, really made the most of it. I mean, I even got out there on one of those little fish hunter dinghies, got myself a little aquascope, and you know, really enjoyed that sort of style of fishing where I was sort of rowing baits out and dropping rigs, that sort of thing. You know, it was really good fun. You know, quite a bit had changed over the years, you know, like there was now a syndicate that had formed on there by a group of local anglers, none of which I knew. So I had to reach out to an old friend that I knew had fished it back in the day, and I knew he'd done a little bit of time on there since as well. So we had a little conversation. He basically put me in contact with the guy that was now running the syndicate. So I gave him a call, and we eventually met up, and he was kind enough to actually offer me a ticket for the following year, which then started in April, which luckily for me was only just around the corner. The lake was around about sort of 10 to 12 acres, and after having a chat with this fella, it was apparent that there'd been a couple of stockings. One was back in 2019, and another one was in 2021, and around about 50 odd fish had gone in over this period. You know, the estimated stock at this point was around about sort of 60 to 80 carp, which was considerably more than what I had to go at back then. I'd spent the first couple of weeks leading up to my ticket, you know, just walking around, getting acquainted with the venue. I took a leading rod round and sort of had a little look for some spots, and I immediately found out that it was still just as weedy then as it was back in the day. So, you know, even though it was early spring, there was still a lot of dead weed from the previous year, and obviously the new stuff coming up. But you know, as I say, I walked around, sort of got myself a bit more familiar with the place, spoke to a few of the other anglers down there, and they all turned out to be quite nice lads, which was fortunate. And you know, I started actually introducing a bit of bait into some of the areas that I thought, you know, looked a bit more special than some others. And one area in particular was what I would call the top end of the lake, and it narrowed off and almost created like a bay. So at this top end, you know, the margins were heavily tree lined, and the branches extended out, you know, quite a way, but at the same time they were quite undercut. And at the top of this bay there was a small set of lily pads that had just started to come up. And on a couple of my walks around, when I'd taken the leading rod, I'd found like a really nice little clear spot up there, and I'd started introducing bait on it, you know, over that couple of weeks, you know, in preparation really for my first session. And the swim in which you could access this area of the lake from was either a swim called the Secret or another swim that was on the other bank, which I think they used to call like the bin or the bench, something like that. And you know, that was where I intended on doing my first session. You know, the weeks leading up to my first session, you know, I was obviously really excited and I couldn't wait. So when that Friday first came around that I could eventually fish the lake, you know, I'd managed to dip out of work a little bit early and I got myself up there, and I managed to get myself into that top swim, which was called the Secret. You know, I arrived mid-afternoon, you know, straight from work, and yeah, basically I just set up in the swim, you know, not really thinking too much about it. You know, I'd already sort of planned what I was going to do, and I got in there and I flicked the rods out and I managed to put a rod over onto this area where I've been pre-baiting. And that evening the bailiff came down and we had a good chat for a couple of hours, and he showed us a couple of photos of the of some of the carp that were in there, some of the old ones that were in there from sort of back in the day, and you know, he showed me a couple of photos of these new stockies. So I had half an idea at this point, you know, what was really going on with the place. But you know, unfortunately I didn't catch anything that session, but I did learn a lot, which was the main thing, you know. And I had quite a good view from that area down towards like the main part of the lake as well, which you know, opened out into quite a big bowl in that sort of centre zone. And whilst I was fishing there that weekend, you know, I did see quite a few fish actually. And then the following week, when I returned, I decided to fish an area in the middle of the lake. So I set up in a swim that they call the Stumps. And on the Saturday morning, I had my first bite, and it resulted in a little common around about 19 pounds. So you know, at this point I was buzzing.
Go on, boy. There you go. Gorgeous.
You know, thinking back to when I used to fish it, you know, you weren't getting bites that often. You know, you especially weren't getting them that quickly. So I was obviously over the moon that I'd managed to sort of land one. And in this time as well, you know, I'd taken a look up onto that area in the pads where this little clear spot was, introduced a little bit more bait down there for the following week. And you know, the rest of that session, you know, passed quite pleasantly. You know, I'd met a few of the other anglers again. We'd had a good chat, and at this point, you know, I'd started to become quite acquainted with a few of them. The following weekend, I went back up and I fished in the Secret, and it was made aware to me that, you know, you could actually use bait boats on this water, and I've never used a bait boat before. So you know, I got straight onto Marketplace that week, and I'd managed to pick myself up like an old Viper. You know, I didn't have any of, like, you know, all the GPS and ultrasound or whatever the bloody hell it is on there or anything like that. It was just a bodge standard bait boat, but it was up for the job. I turned up at the lake, you know, with this bait boat in tow, and managed to put a rod as perfectly as I possibly could have done on this clear area that was off the side of these pads. So I'd gone round to the other side, and I'd managed to get through the bushes, flick my marker rod out onto the spot, ran back round to the swim, rigged up the rod, dropped a load of bait in the hopper, you know, put my rig in it and all that sort of stuff, and I then sent the bait boat on its way up to this area. And I'd run back round to where the marker float was, and drove the boat as close as I could to this marker. And just before I dropped it, I whipped the marker float out of the way, let the hopper go, and everything obviously went on the spot, with pinpoint accuracy. So I've now gone back round to the swim, obviously settled the line, clipped the bobbin on, all that sort of stuff, and that rod was set. And the other two were just flicked out in front with a bit of a spread of boilies over them, where I'd seen some fish that were passing through, our walks around. So they were definitely getting in and out of this area, but I didn't want to disturb that end too much. As the evening drew to a close and I was sort of, just settling in, I thought, I forget whether or not what the moon phase was, but I'm pretty sure there may well have been a full moon that night. I'll have to double check, but I'm pretty sure there was. And I'd gone to sleep, and around about 3:30 in the morning, that left-hander up to the top of the bay had then sort of sprung into life and ripped off. And I picked the rod up, and I'm thinking to myself now, bloody hell, I'd had a bite the week before, I've got a bite now, and as I lifted into the fish, and luckily for me, that fish had actually kited out of the bay, and by the time I'd caught up with it, it was in front of me. And not too much of a battle or anything like that, a couple of lunges sort of in the margin, and before I knew it, I'd netted this big mirror. I looked down into the folds of the net, and I hadn't really seen too many photographs of the fish, and I didn't have any saved, so at this point I didn't really know which one it was, but I knew it was a big fish.
Look at the size of that. I have no idea what fish it is.
And I ran round to the other side where there was a fella fishing, and but at this point it was 4 o'clock in the morning. I didn't even realise, but I'd woken him up and said, "Hello mate, you're right, look, I've got one in the net, any chance you could come and give us a hand?" To which he got up and was, happy to do so. I think he was as keen as I was to see what I'd had. So we got round and we sorted the fish out, put her on the scales, that sort of thing, and she went £35.8. We put her in the sack, not in the sack, but we put her in the sling, just a retaining sling, just for a short period of time. And that was it, he retired to his bivvy. I'd sort of got myself sorted out. I didn't bother putting the rod back out because it was a bit of a pain in the arse to do in the dark, especially considering how I put the rod in the first place. And I dropped the bailiff a text message, and I just sort of said, look, I've got a nice one in the net, it's going to be light in a couple of hours, do you mind coming and doing the photos? So that morning he turned up, and as I took her out of the water and put her on the mat, he's turned around and gone to me, "That's floppy tail." And I thought to myself, bloody hell, is it really? Out of all the fish that I'd seen in this lake, that was the one that if I had to put my mind to it, that was the one that I wanted the most. So I'm 3 weeks into this new adventure, and I've already got the one that I wanted, and I didn't really know what else was really in there at the time. So we got all the photos done, that sort of thing. Bailiff stayed around for a little while, and we had a couple of cups of tea and a good chat. And whilst we were talking, he's got his phone out, and we're flicking through some images of these fish. And I thought, I didn't know that was in here, and I started to get a real taste for what was coming next, So even though I'd had, what I would consider my main target already, I still had the excitement to carry on, because some of the fish that he was showing me were just too hard, some of the fish that he was showing me were just too nice to pass up. There was a couple of real nice commons in there, a few other nice mirrors, and that was it, I just wanted to continue really, it all happened so quickly, but I'd obviously only just got this ticket and I wanted to make the most of it. I didn't really have anywhere else to go anyway. The following week, I'd turned up, and one of the blokes had gone to me. It was a bloke actually that I'd called to come and give me a hand in the middle of the night, and he sort of mentioned to me, one of the younger members on there had found out that I'd caught this fish, and he'd actually gone up there, and he couldn't find a clear spot. So what he'd actually done, he'd chucked the rake out on a rope, and he started dragging the area, so he pretty much raked the spot. And he'd actually, from what I was told, pulled in a few of my boilies from when I'd been pre-baiting during the week. So that was a little bit gutting, and I have to be honest, I didn't even bother fishing that swim again after that. I ended up plotting up in a swim that was sort of further up that end of the lake, not quite towards the centre of the lake, but I guess 3/4 of the way up, and I'd set up in there. So yeah, to cut a long story short, this fella who had raked the spot, he'd started to go round there and he'd walk past me and go, "Oh, I'm going up there today, going to have one. I know you had one out there the previous week." And he mentioned about a common that was called Barrett's. So he said, "Oh, I'm having Barrett's tonight." I said, "Do us a favour, mate." I said, "If you see her, send her down my way." And we must have talked it into existence. The Saturday morning, one of the other guys that were down there that were bailiffing it sort of entered my swim. And as we were sitting there, he said to me, "Have you seen anything?" I said, "No, I've not really seen too much." And literally at that moment, this giant common had sort of just shuffled out of the water. So I said to him, "Mate, look, did you just see that?" He was like, No, what?" I said, "Look, there was a big common just out there, just towards the middle of the lake." He went, "Where?" And all of a sudden, as he'd looked round, it'd come up again. So I quickly cranked in one of the rods, and I put this rod straight on top of his head, and settled the line, clipped the bobbin on, all that, put the kettle on. Me and this fella are now having a cup of tea, having a little chat, this, that and the other. Eventually he's finished his tea and he's walked off halfway down the bank, and he mustn't have got very far, because that rod that I just put on this fish had just sprung into life, and line was ripping off the clutch, all of that. And I picked the rod up, and I was connected to something that was clearly quite big. Initially, on this fish, as the line was ripping off, this fish had managed to put itself into a weed bed. I've mentioned obviously the lake, at this point was getting quite weedy, and it'd been a month or two. No, it'd been a month at this point. Since I first started putting a mark rod, a leading rod out there, and all that. But the weed had come up a little bit more, and this fish had buried itself into a big bowl of weed out there. So a little bit of tension, I managed to get the fish moving, and finally landed it. With a bit of a bowl of weed on its head. And I've looked into the net, and I've removed some of the weed, and there it was. There was this long, what was clearly quite a long common that was now sitting in the folds of my net. And I'd quickly shouted, I've got this bailiff's number, so I've called him up and I've gone, "Mate, if you're around, any chance you can come back?" He was like, "Well, what's happened?" I said, I've just had that common, I think." And he was like, "You're joking, ain't you?" So he's run back up the bank, and he's come to help me out with his fish. And would you believe it, there she was in the folds of my net, Barrett's. And after the devastating blow of having that spot just absolutely ripped apart after putting all that time and effort into it, to then catch another one of the A-team, I was buzzing off my head at this point, and I just felt like this is just the gift that keeps on giving, So I gave my friend Lee a call to find out where he was, because I knew he'd want to see the fish, and luckily for me he was only 10 minutes up the road. So me and the bailiff sort of hung around for a minute. Lee come down, he had his 2 little girls with him, and we done the photos of the fish and all that, and they were amazed just to see how big it was. And that was it, you know, like I'd had these two fish, that, you know, these two special fish out of there, and I just couldn't wait to see what else was in there. You know, like some of it was a bit of a mystery after talking to a few of the blokes, you know, there was rumours of another big mirror. At this point I just didn't know, but I'm 4 weeks into a campaign, I've had two of the big ones, and it just couldn't have been any better. So after my capture of Barrett's, you know, things drew to a little bit of a halt, you know. Fishing had slowed up on there. I mean, it wasn't doing loads and loads of bites anyway. I mean, I was quite fortunate to have the ones that I had, as I soon found out. But the weed had come right up, and you know, the fish were just holding up in places, and landing them was an issue. You know, I had a couple of bites, but I was soon told, and I didn't realise at the time, but I was soon told that the braided mainline was banned. So I had to switch over to a mono. And I think I had about 4 runs that summer. You know, it was just absolutely rock hard on there. But unfortunately, every single one of those fish, I had some that come up, like, you know, I had some that I lost to hook pulls. I was cut off by another one, and I even had one. And to this day, I will never know what it was. But I had one sort of, you know, pick me up and tow me right down to my left side, my left margin. And it didn't matter what I put on this fish, I just couldn't turn it, and eventually the line parted. So, like, my summer, unfortunately, you know, wasn't exactly as prolific as I wanted it to be.
Right, come on. Come on. Just come on.
But the summer in general as well, I mean, going back, you know, the summer was good fun, you know. Everyone down there was wicked, you know. We all sort of got together, had the socials, that sort of thing, and you know, it was just a really, really nice place to be. You know, fishing obviously, you know, almost became secondary throughout that summer period, because we knew we were just, you know, almost banging our heads against a brick wall. But you know, the camaraderie of those lads down there, and the friends that I've now made that I'm sure will be friends for life, you know, every minute of it was just brilliant down there. The atmosphere was great. Autumn was a little bit better, you know. Fishing was still really, really slow on there, but you know, I think I managed a stocky mirror. I repeated that first common as well that I'd had on my second session, my first one out of there, in the same session as that stocky mirror.
But as I said before, you know, the fishing was quite slow. You know, nothing really picked up and became too prolific. It just seemed to be, you know, seemingly quite hard, and you know, the fish would trickle out every now and again, but it was you know, few and far between.
So I landed my last one out of there that year on the 28th of December, which is an important date in my fishing. It was basically when I first, you know, got up and got off my bum and started going again. So I was, you know, super pleased. I sort of dubbed the fish the anniversary fish. So you know, that was the end of my winter. You know, depths of December again. You know, freezing cold, and you know, I managed another stocky mirror out of there.
This could be a bigger one.
Coming in slowly.
I can hear it, I can hear it. It's on the surface. Hey, hello, I can see you. Who are you?
Hello, mate.
You kidding me? Oh, you kidding me? Caught underneath this peg. Uh-oh. It's alright, I got you. It's alright, it's alright. You got it? Don't snatch at it. Don't snatch at it, don't snatch at it. Don't snatch at it. Don't, go, 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 go. That's it, that's it, that's it. Come on, a boy. She looks tonking in the water actually, doesn't she? Oh, lovely, look at that. Oh, that's sick. That is sick, mate.
Spring was alright, you know. Spring came around and, you know, the lake was sort of quite slow to wake up. And I can't remember exactly the sort of time it might have been. I guess it was around about sort of April again, and I'd managed to sort of nick a couple of bites out of there from that sort of swimming 3/4 of the way up the lake. You know, as I said, I've ignored this sort of top bay now, and you know, I found a zone in this area which, you know, kept on doing me bites. So I just thought I'm going to carry on. So you know, around April time, I managed a decent sized common. But one of the fish that really sort of took me by surprise was a ghostie that I'd had. So there was thought to only be one ghostie in this lake, and it was quite a big one. And that sort of that summer that went by, a friend of mine I'd met on there as well, Grant, who, as it turns out to be, was the fella that I'd run round to when I'd had floppy tail. Me and him became quite friendly, but you know, he had the ghostie out of there, this other little ghostie. And you know, as I said, like, you know, we only thought there was one in there, but as it turns out, there was obviously two. And you know, going back forward to spring, I'd actually managed to catch that ghostie. It was a bit of a palaver, if I'm going to be honest. You know, there's an aerator that sits out in the middle of the lake, and you know, I've had this bite, and the fish had started kiting. I've sort of kept a nice tight line to it and all that. You know, as far as I was aware, I was sort of safe as houses. But all of a sudden, you know, everything ground to a halt, and this fish had obviously managed to snag itself on something out in the middle of the pond. And to my knowledge, you know, the pipe or wire or whatever it was that went out to this aerator had scaffold tubes around it. So, you know, we were under the assumption that it was all sort of pinned down on the bottom of the lake. But unfortunately, you know, that wasn't the case. So I've called the bailiff up, and he's managed to come down with a boat, and I'd had to wait a little while. It was a good hour, but the fish definitely was still on. And eventually he turned up with a boat, and I've sort of jumped in that, and I've gone out there with a net, you know, just sort of pulled myself along the line, you know, just to get over the top of the fish. And lo and behold, I looked down and I saw a ghostie in the water, and I thought, bloody hell, that didn't half look big. So I thought it might have been the big one. And after you know, like a proper performance out there. Every time I tried to sort of get the net underneath it, the net was almost acting like an oar and pulling me away from the fish. And you know, eventually though, I did manage to bundle the fish into the net and get it back to dry land. And it turned out to be that ghostie at 31 pound 10. So it put on a bit of weight as well. You know, early spring, you know, they're obviously still carrying that weight from the winter and that, and you know, the spawn's coming through as well. So you know, she looked really, really good. So I was pleased with that.
Rob.
Still taking pictures, mate? I think so, yeah. I'm going to get moaned at and I'll do it quite later, but... Get good at this, I reckon.
Can't touch it, mate. Look at that. Down underneath me rods. Oh, look at that.
Oh, that's sick. Follow it away. Colour of that in the water.
I managed a few more that spring. I think I managed a couple more sort of smaller commons. Like, they weren't stockies, but you know, they weren't big fish either. But one of them actually, one of them was a real cracker, a real dark one. You know, proper old looking thing. So I was well happy with that. And then I had some time off there. You know, the fishing had again become really, really stout. And from the previous summer, I thought, do you know what, I'm not going to sit it out here and sort of bang my head against a brick wall again. I'm going to have a little look around for somewhere else. And I eventually ended up on a place in the Lea Valley that I'll go into a little bit more later. And it wasn't until, I think, October sort of time that I'd returned. You know, I'd done my summer. I'd done my summer elsewhere, as I said, and during that period of time I'd actually had an operation at the end of that summer, so I'd had a couple of weeks off as well. But as soon as I could get back on the banks, I'd managed to do a session back down the Park Lake, and I managed another little common out of there, and actually another little water come up, funnily enough, that was mentioned to me, and that'll be a story for another time also. But I then returned on a social, and me and another lad that I'd met down there had planned to go and fish it. And up until this point, you know, I'd pretty much had, you know, the ones that I really, really wanted. There was one more in there, and it didn't really do too many bites. And you know, by this point, as I said, the fishing did become quite stale on there. You know, people were really struggling that year. But you know, that one mirror that, you know, was always sort of at the back of my mind, I still hadn't caught. So anyway, I turned up to do this social. I turned up a day before my mate, and I'd managed a 31 pound mirror in the night, and that was one of the stockies actually, but quite a nice one.
And as soon as I'd netted that one, my right hand rod had ripped off, and before I knew it, I had two in the net.
In fact, I forgot to mention actually, but I'd had a couple of catches of this fish by now, but that Barrett's just wouldn't leave me alone. I'd had a bite off of her in the summer, and I'd landed her, and then again this evening that had just come through, like, you know, doing this social, I'd had her again. then the following day, or the following evening actually, after my mate had turned up, we'd sort of had a social throughout the day. I'd sort of told him the tales of the previous night, you know, that sort of thing. And that night we'd sort of settled down, got into our bags, and you know, it wasn't long before one of my rods was away. So I'd had the 31 mirror the night before. I've just had Barrett's again, and as I said, I didn't bother putting the rod back out. You know, I already still had 2 out there, and I didn't want to disturb anything too much. And yeah, I can't remember what time it was actually, but it was quite late, and my left-hander that was out to one of these islands was away. You know, I've picked up the rod, and a real sort of good battle sort of then took place in the dark, and I've managed to land this mirror. And I wouldn't have even have guessed that it was that one, but you know, I'm looking in the net and I'm thinking, no, I had a bad size one. You know, I woke my mate up and said, look, I've got one here. And it wasn't until we put it on the mat and I looked at it and I thought, I'm sure that's the quarter Lin. And you know, we put her in a retainer. You know, it was going to be light again. This is, you know, sort of, I don't know, probably around about 3-4 o'clock in the morning, I think. But we put her in the retainer. And I took a picture of her while she was on the mat, and then I went back through my photos to see whether or not I could find a picture of this quarter Lin. And there it was, you know, like the last one that I really, really wanted. But yeah, my last session on a social, hat-trick of big fish, and the final piece of the puzzle was there in the folds of my net. And you know, that was it. We'd done the photos in the morning, I got some wicked footage. And yeah, that was the end of my Park Lake campaign, really. You know, 18 months overall, and I've still got the ticket to this day because I love the place and the people down there. It's just great, you know, and I will have a dabble on there again. But for now, I'm journeying through the valley.
Look big, didn't she?
Got like a little bollock on it.
Little skin taggy type thing, look. Here they go. Look how gutty she looks, Tom.
It's mega, mate.
What's a creature?
Little nibble and nibble. Hey, good catch.
Raiders of the shout, aren't they?
Either in soap.
Come on, girl. You're going up. You're
That's
going
it.
up.
I've
You're
got
like,
it
you're
already.
like.
Devil, stop it. That looks relic like that.
He's a relic.
Yeah. I love his little panic twist. Oh, that looks good. Yeah, happy days.
See you later, girlie. There she goes. Go on. Good flipping width of it.